A man called Peter. Peter Marshall wanted nothing more than to be in the British Navy. See how God led him to be a preacher in America. Peter Marshall did not grow up wanting to be a minister. That was God's idea, not his. In fact, it took quite a lot of divine persuasion to get him to accept that plan. He was born in Coatbridge, Scotland, a city of 45,000, nicknamed the Iron Burg, because it was the chief center of the Scottish iron trade. Since Coatbridge was only 9 miles east of Glasgow, the sea of the famous Clyde shipyards were never far away. When Peter was very young, he fell under the spell of all the color and romance of the British Navy tradition. At that time, the British Navy signed boys at 15 years and 9 months. Soon after Peter's 14th birthday, he decided that he would conveniently age a year and 9 months overnight. So he said farewell to his friends at school, informing them that he was joining the Navy. At dawn the next day, he slipped away from home to the recruiting station and proceeded to apply for enlistment, saying that he was the required age. For a year or more, he had been doing violent stretching exercises to acquire the proper height. His Navy career lasted but 2 days. His enlistment papers were discovered. Since he was actually only 14, his parents refused to give their consent, and a very eager A.B. was lost to Jellicoe's fleet. A bitter disappointment and crestfallen boy secretly sobbed himself to sleep that night. Peter did not understand it then, but this was the first big step in God's guidance for his life. Often, God has to shut a door in our face so that he can subsequently open the door through which he wants us to go. People today wonder about this matter of God having a detailed plan, a blueprint for each individual in the universe. If there is really a God, they ask, and if he is interested in me, how do I go about getting in touch with him? How does he talk to people today? Peter Marshall's story answers these questions out of one man's rich experience. I can imagine God saying, "There is a boy down in Lanarkshire. I have a plan for him. He is to go to America in order to enter the ministry. He will spend almost half of his life in the United States. His life and his ministry will bless thousands of people. I have all the circumstances planned and all my helpers designated to make sure that my plan does not go awry." So the hand that firmly shut the door to a career in the Royal Navy in order to open the way into the ministry was really God's, not man's. Peter, however, like most of his countrymen, was born doggedly resolute. He would not easily give up his cherished ambition. Having told his high school friends that he was leaving to join the Royal Navy, a boyish pride made him unwilling to go back and face personal ridicule. The only alternative was to begin working. By day, he started as an office boy with a firm of civil engineers, and 4 nights a week, from 7 to 10, he went to the Coatbridge Technical School, where he studied mechanical engineering. At home, in any spare minutes left, he studied semaphore and Morse, and stewed over trig problems, feverishly working against the day when he might get another try at the Navy. So thoroughly did he learn the international code of flag signals that all his life he could read much of the colored bunting fluttering from the halyards of ships entering and leaving port. Years later, a missionary returned from China spoke to young people in the Buchanan Street Kirk. He came as a representative of the London Missionary Society and was not seeking money, but recruits, volunteers for life for the mission fields. Peter was deeply touched by this appeal. He knew that his own father had once offered his life as a missionary, but for some reason which Peter was never able to ascertain, had been turned down. In addition, Eric Liddell had just announced that he was going to China as a missionary under the auspices of the Congregational Church. Peter longed to follow his hero's steps. At any rate, whatever the influences, from that moment Peter knew that his call was for full-time Christian service. That afternoon, as the close of the meeting, he stood up and stated publicly that he accepted the missionary's challenge. "I have determined," he said, "to give my life to God for him to use me wherever he wants me." At this juncture, James Broadbent, a cousin who had immigrated to the United States, came back to Scotland on a visit. Though Jim had arrived at Ellis Island with even less than the minimum amount of money required by the immigration authorities, he had subsequently been most successful in America. He was an engineer for the M.W. Kellogg Company in New York. He had made a quick trip over to Scotland from Swansea, Wales, where he was doing a job for the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. Jim carefully inquired about his cousin Peter. When he found out where Peter was employed, he sought him out at the tube mill. A Mr. Ashe was then one of the head men at Stewart's and Lloyd's. Jim knew him well. "What section is Peter Marshall in?" he inquired. "Poles and derricks," Mr. Ashe answered promptly. "Go on down and see him if you like." A glad reunion followed. "Look," Jim said finally, "I won't be in town long. How about taking the rest of the day off? Then we could really have time to talk." A few minutes later, the two men were heading toward Peter's boarding house on Laird Street. While Peter was washing up and getting out of his overalls, Jim Broadbent looked curiously around the room. It was a little attic room with dormer windows. A simple iron bed was against one wall. There were several chairs and many books on the wall. On one wall was a large old-fashioned clock. Hanging under it, on a peg, were Peter's kilts. Jim was busy looking at Peter's books when he came back. "I don't understand this, Peter," he said. "What on earth is an engineer doing with these books?" "Beginning Greek, Hebrew, of all things. All this theology and stuff?" Peter flushed slightly. "Well, you see, Jim, I want to be a minister. It's rough going, though." With little encouragement from Jim, the whole story poured out. All of the developments, difficulties, and disappointments of the last years. Jim looked very thoughtful. "You know, my early life was remarkably like yours. My father died when I was very young, just as your father, my Uncle Peter, did. I, too, had a stepfather. I, too, had to fetch for myself. I was awful fond of Uncle Peter. I'd do almost anything for his son. Look, Peter, why don't you go to America to enter the ministry?" "But, Jim, I don't want to go to America. Why should I? Besides, I haven't any money for passage." "Never mind that. Look, we've got just as many sinners in the United States as Scotland ever had. It's easier to get on over there. If you want to go, I'd gladly stake you to the United States." Jim then pointed out that it was possible to work one's way through school in the United States, and that many generous scholarships were available. But though he painted a rosy picture of all the opportunities in the New World, even the opportunities in the American ministry, Peter still had no desire to go. In fact, going to the United States seemed to him the last thing he wanted to do. He agreed to pray about it, though, to ask God if this could possibly be part of his plan, and to let Jim know his decision. "I have to leave tonight for London," explained Jim, "but I'm due to be back in Paisley for a business conference on Monday. Tell you what, why don't you have dinner with me Monday night, say at the Central Station Hotel in Glasgow? Bring your girl along. We'll talk more about it then." But on Monday night, when the three of them met, Peter was still not able to give Jim a definite answer. Peter prayed about it for 3 weeks, but no answer came. Then, one Sunday afternoon, as he was walking through the rhododendron-lined lane in the Sholto Douglas estate, suddenly the chief gave him his marching orders. "It would be hard to describe to anyone how God can make his will so plain to a man at times," Peter said later. "I was walking along that lane, puzzling over the decision before me, weighing this factor against that, as one does at such a time, when all at once, I knew. The answer was just a clear-cut, strong inner conviction, quite unmistakable, that God wanted me in the United States of America."